Hello! During the last video on pain transduction, I promised that I'd talk this time about neural coding in nociception, and here I am to deliver on that promise. As we covered in the last video, many of the underlying mechanisms of pain transduction are still unknown. I did not know that when I started this project, so I'm afraid that pain coding is even more mysterious than transduction. However, I'm going to break down what I've learned about the topic as best I can for you. So, what is neural coding? This is kind of a buzzword that can be often misused and overgeneralized. But basically, coding refers to the translation that cells and systems make between receiving a stimulus and producing signals, whether electrical, chemical, whatever. The idea that information is being coded in the transmissions from neurons implies that if we had the proper knowledge, we'd be able to read the code. In the most simple form, this neural coding could be binary. Either the neuron spikes or it doesn't. Yes or no. If we invent an imaginary neuron that senses heat, then its spike could mean hot and no spike could mean not. Hot or not. More information could be carried if the neuron were usually spiking at a certain rate, even when there was no stimulus, something we would call basal activity. If the neuron spikes more than its basal rate, that would convey one thing. But if it were to drop below that basal rate, that might mean something else. In the case of our heat-sensing neuron, maybe below basal rate means chilly, and above basal rate means hot. And the basal activity itself would just be normal body temperature. These are examples of neural coding at its most basic level. One neuron transmitting a message by itself. Researchers don't even fully understand neural coding at the single cell level. For nociceptive neurons that can sense both innocuous and noxious heat, it's unclear how they transmit that difference. There are some theories, but in order to understand those, we'll have to talk a bit about spike versus rate-based coding. The debate over spike-based and rate-based coding is kind of a false dichotomy and really shouldn't be applied to the brain in any generalized way. But basically, spike-based coding means that each spike and the neuron from which it is produced is vital to the information that is being passed along. Rate-based coding means that the total sum, or the pattern of the spikes, is what is necessary to transmit the information. Both of these ideas rely on the premise that a network or group of neurons are working together to send a message to some other part of the brain. Now, I bring up spike-based and rate-based coding because one of the papers about nociceptive coding claims to have found a rate-based pattern of noxious cold and nociception in Drosophila. Drosophila of fruit flies. They're a great model organism, meaning an animal that scientists choose to study instead of humans because they have relatively few neurons when compared to other animals. It is also easier to image the neurons in Drosophila than it is in other creatures because the flies are semi-transparent. In this particular paper that I referenced earlier by Onodera, the authors identified what they called a burst and pause pattern in a certain type of neuron in Drosophila called class 4 neurons. When the cold stimulus reaches a painful level, the high firing rate of these neurons changes from tonic firing, or rapid, kind of consistent spikes, to a non-rhythmic stuttering-like pattern that the researchers named burst and pause. They believe that this pattern is indicative of rate coding. So if the neuron's firing rate increases as the stimuli increases in intensity, then more active class 4 neurons in this case would indicate a colder stimulus. However, remember that neurons naturally have a refractory period between spikes when the neuron cannot fire. Because of this, the time between spikes, aka the interspike interval, can't be shorter than the refractory period. Therefore, there's some upper limit to the speed at which a neuron can repetitively fire. The authors of this paper think that neurons overcome this physical limit by using this burst and pause rate coding pattern so they can transmit information about very intense stimuli. Personally, I'm skeptical that these neurons would need to overcome the limitation because, one, I haven't seen a lot of data showing the neural firing response to increasingly intense stimuli, just a lot of recordings from stimuli that's either innocuous or noxious. This doesn't mean it's not out there, just that I haven't found it in my research yet. Secondly, when I think about it intuitively, it would seem that all noxious temperatures above or below certain thresholds could be coded by the same pattern. If you put a hand on a hot stove, you reflexively pull back, no matter if the burner were set at 7 or 9. You don't need to discriminate between intensity of noxious heat in order to trigger that reflex. So as long as the neuron can distinguish noxious from innocuous, it really doesn't seem like it would matter that the neuron had some upper limit, as long as it was in the noxious range. I'm definitely not saying the authors are wrong. I'm just retaining some healthy skepticism until I see further research. One of the biggest problems with trying to understand how nociception is coded is that no one really knows which neurons are involved. Unlike the visual system, where we know that photoreceptors transmit to bipolar and amacrine cells, which transmit to retinal ganglion cells, and so on and so forth, there is no circuit known for nociception. It's only recently that neurons downstream to the class 4 neurons in Drosophila have been identified. These are called, are you ready? Medial clusters of class 4 dendrite arborization second-order neurons. Phew, what a name. Using optogenetic technology, researchers can stimulate just these second-order neurons, and when they are active, it leads to the same behavior in the fruit fly that noxious heat does, rolling around in a certain way. But this is only in the humble fruit fly. Understanding of nociceptive coding is clearly only in its infancy. How can we hope to decode the patterns of transmission of transductory neurons when we don't even know where it's being sent? Uncovering the pathway or circuit of pain transduction is essential for understanding the meaning behind the electrical and chemical signals of these neurons. We certainly have a lot to learn. Thank you for watching.